It's time now to discuss a very important aspect in WordPress theme creation, and the reason for its importance is that it concerns security, and that is validation, sanitization, and escaping. So imagine this is the post creation page in the WP admin. So we have our post title and the post content, and also imagine we have a custom field that is called price. And don't worry, we will talk about custom fields later in the course. But briefly, custom fields are just extra fields that we add to our post in order to add more information in our post. So whenever we click save, our data will go into the database. Now imagine this is the front end of our website, which our theme is responsible for. And we now want to display the data that we just saved. So we request the data from the database, and we just display the data somewhere in the theme, right? So sounds easy. But what if now the user entered something that is not a number? The value will be saved to the database, and that's what will be displayed in the front end. So we want to avoid this from happening, and that's where we can use validation. So validation is the process of comparing the data against a set of rules or patterns, and then decide whether to pass the data or just discard it. So in our case, we want to make sure that the price is an integer. So we can pass the user input to a function called intval. Intval will try to convert whatever the user typed into an integer, and if it couldn't, it will just return 0. So we can check if the return of this function is 0, then we will discard the value, otherwise we will pass it. So in our case, what we typed will be converted to 230, and this is what will be saved in the database. If intval, however, returned 0, we will discard the operation completely. We won't even touch the database, because our data is invalid. So validation should be the very first thing to check before using the data. This way you will know whether you have valid data to work with, or you will just have to discard it. So this is the definition of validation according to WordPress. And validation is very strict. You have to decide whether your data is valid or not. There is no middle ground. And in order to perform validation, you can use built-in PHP functions like isSet, empty, string length, pregmatch, count, inArray, and so on. And we'll have some examples throughout this course. You can also use some of WordPress's functions like isEmail to check if a value is a valid email or not, and other custom WordPress functions. I'll put you a link to these functions so you can read more about them. You can also create your own custom functions, like maybe you need to check if a value is a valid US phone number or a zip number, and so on. Imagine now another situation where you maybe need to give your users some liberty to write whatever they want. So in our example, let's say you need to give the user the ability to type the price as a string and not as a number, in order to type the currency symbol and not just the value. In this case, it will be hard to validate the user's input, and that's because there are no clear rules on what's valid and what's invalid. So in this case, you can skip validation, and whatever the user typed, it will just appear in the front end. So that's very simple, and we didn't have to do anything actually, but that's very unsafe. If you, for instance, have someone who does data entry for you, and this person maybe is not very trustworthy, he can maybe enter some malicious code here in the price field, right? This code will be then saved to the database, and when you display it on your front end, the script will actually run. And this is very dangerous. So how can we give our users a bit of liberty, but at the same time make sure that no code will be saved into the database? And the answer is sanitization. Sanitization is the process of cleaning your input data from anything that you would not like to save to the database, like code, for example. WordPress provides us with some great sanitization functions, like sanitize text field, for example, which is used when you are expecting your data to be just text. Sanitization functions should be the last thing you do before saving to your database. That's why in the diagram I put it a bit close to the database. So clean your data and save. So sanitize text field in our case will remove the script tag and the value will be saved as 230. And thus when we display our data, no scripts will run. So as you can see, unlike validation, sanitization can actually modify the data. In validation, however, you can either use the data or just discard it completely. So this is the definition of validation according to WordPress. So it's the process of cleaning or filtering your input data, so you can use it when you don't know what to expect, or you don't want to be very strict with data validation. WordPress also provides a lot of great functions for sanitization. I'll put a link to them so you can read more about them. Now, let's say we have the same situation where we would like to give the user the liberty to type anything. And let's assume that we've done something wrong in our validation, or maybe forgot to sanitize, or maybe we've done our validation and sanitization, but some malicious user managed to inject some code in our database somehow. So now we have some code sitting in our database, and when we display this data in the front end, this code will run, right? And this is where we will have to use escaping. Escaping is the process of securing the output by stripping some unwanted data like some HTML tags or script tags. WordPress also provides some great escaping functions, but in our case we should use escape HTML since we are rendering HTML into the screen. So what escaping will do is that instead of rendering the script tag as code, it will render it as text. So this way it will be harmless and nothing inside it will actually run. And this way we have prevented scripts from running even though it's saved in the database. So escaping is the most important part in this process, because that's when we render data to our users. And it should be done the very last thing before outputting the data. And this is referred to as late escape. So here is the WordPress definition of escaping. And here are some of the escaping functions. Escape HTML, for example, will be used if you are rendering something inside HTML tags, like maybe rendering a title inside of h1 tags. We also have escape URL when you are outputting a URL, like for example in a source attribute or an href. Escape JS for when you are rendering inline JavaScript. We also have escape attribute for when you are outputting something in an HTML attribute, like maybe a class or a title, and so on. And finally, escape text area when you are outputting something inside of a text area. In some cases, you can also use sanitization functions instead of escaping functions when you are rendering something in your theme. So let's take a quick look on the difference between sanitization and escaping. So suppose we have this text in our database, and now we want to output it in our theme. So escaping will render the HTML tags as text instead of rendering it as code, right? Sanitization, however, will not render the HTML tags at all. So depending on your situation, you can either use escaping or sanitization functions when you render something in your theme. So I hope this is clear, and if not, don't worry, we will use these functions a lot throughout this course, and I think by the time things will become more clear. In fact, let's see in the code that we've written so far if we can use any of these functions. So let's open index.php and let's check all the functions that get something from the database and see if we have to sanitize or escape any data. So here we have the permalink, we have the title attributes, we have the title, and we have the except, and we also have the two custom functions that we've written. So let's start with the permalink. So WordPress functions can sometimes need escaping, and sometimes WordPress will just handle it. So in order to know, let's Google the function. And let's click on this link. And then let's scroll down and see the discussion below. And as you can see in this example, it's used directly without any escaping. And the reason is, if we took a look at the source code for the function, WordPress already echoes and escapes the result of get permalink, right? So when we use the permalink, we don't have to escape because it's already escaped. If we use get permalink, however, we will have to escape. And we'll see that in the helper functions that we've written, we use the get permalink in them. So in this case, we will have to escape. But when we use the permalink, there is no need to escape. So let's go back. We have the title attributes, and the purpose of this function is to actually clean the title in order to be used in a title attribute. So it's definitely safe to use this function without any escaping. The title is kind of debatable. By default, WordPress does not escape the title, but they do that deliberately. And that's because some users, like admins, can actually type HTML in the title. So you can just escape the title. This way you will be removing a feature that WordPress deliberately allows. So to keep the title safe, just don't give any admin access to someone who's not trusted. Other user types like authors or contributors will not be allowed to type HTML in the title. And finally, the except is also safe. WordPress will also handle it. So let's see the helper functions that we've written. And here we have get permalink. And as we mentioned, if we use get permalink and not the permalink, we will have to escape it. And it's a URL, so escape URL and then get permalink. And then we have get the date. And this is probably safe, but just in case we can also escape it. So this is an HTML attribute, so we can use escape attribute, right? And then we have get the date again, but inside HTML tags. So escape HTML. Next we have the author URL, so we can use escape URL around the whole URL. And we have the author username, so we can use escape HTML for this one. Get the permalink is actually the same as get permalink. It's just an alias, and it also needs escaping, so let's escape URL. And then the title attribute and get the title. We already mentioned that these are safe. So that's it for escaping and sanitization and validation. We haven't yet done any validation or sanitization, but when we get into the admin stuff, the WP admin, we will do a lot of them. So see you in the next lecture.